Good evening, our lovely detectives. Welcome to the House of Seven Names, a mystery where our favorite detective, Hercule Poirot, goes at it again. These are the little grey cells, and thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. But before we start, I would love to make an announcement. We took some time off to prepare something for our loyal, lovely listeners all over the world, to thank you for your time and dedication. As a detective wears his suit and smart attire, we thought you might enjoy your own uniform and equipment for listening to our stories. That being said, you can now find our own apparel on RedBubble. From t-shirts, mugs for your tisane, clocks to track our uploads, hats, so you feel like a true detective, to even journals to keep track of who is the main suspect. Just go into the link in the description, pick a design you like, and all of the products will be listed. We want to thank you for the journey and hope that you will support us this way. Anyways, now let's get back to the story. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The House of Stages. If I die before Saturday, burn this invitation. Hercule Poirot read the sentence once more, tilting the card to the light, and liked it no better than he had in London. The boat carried him across a narrow strip of bright water toward an island that did not, in his opinion, look in the least like a place where a man ought to die. The sea sparkled with a cheerfulness he found almost vulgar. Fishing boats leaned together in the middle distance. The weather, in short, was offensively pleasant, and Poirot did not trust it. It was the first week of June, and the roses, he had been told, were in bloom. Somewhere ahead, a manor waited on its cliff, and inside it a man who signed himself Sebastian Weil, and in Poirot's breast pocket lay 4 letters from that man, each stranger than the one before it. He had read them on the train down from Paddington until he knew them by heart, and knowing them by heart had brought him no nearer to understanding them, which was a state of affairs Poirot endured very badly. The boatman jerked his chin toward the shore. He was a taciturn Cornishman, with a face like weathered rope, and he had not spoken a dozen words since the harbour. Causeways under till evening, sir. Tide takes the road twice a day. Regular as a clock, and while the road is taken, Poirot inquired, one cannot leave, nor come, sir. Island keeps what it's got. Poirot considered this. You have carried many guests to this house? A few. The boatman spat neatly over the side, into the sparkling water. More this week than most years put together. Indeed. And do they return, these guests? By your boat? When the road is given back? The man looked at him then, a slow sideways look from under the brim of his cap, as though Poirot had said something faintly improper. Some do. Some have the big house send 'em over. I don't ask. He turned his attention back to the tiller. Island business is island business. Poirot said nothing more. He disliked the phrase the man had used. Island keeps what it's got. It suggested a house with appetites. St. Aldwyn's Folly rose above them as the boat drew in, and Poirot understood at once why the word folly had been chosen. The manor was Victorian, tall and dark, built by a man who had loved the idea of a house more than the comfort of one. Turrets stood where no turret was needed. Coloured glass caught the sun and threw it back in fragments, so that the upper windows seemed to wink at the approaching boat. The whole edifice leaned very slightly toward the sea, the way a man leans to overhear talk not meant for him. Below the cliff, the water moved black and unhurried against the rock, and Poirot, who had a townsman's respect for any element he could not regulate, looked at it and looked away. A young woman waited on the steps. She was perhaps 30, soberly dressed in grey, with the contained manner of someone used to managing the affairs of a person more famous than herself. She did not so much smile as arrange her features into the memory of one. Monsieur Poirot, I am Evelyn Moore, Mr. Vale's secretary. He is delighted you have come. She paused, and something moved behind her eyes and was gone. We all are. All, said Poirot pleasantly. There are to be 7 guests. You make the 7th. She turned to the door before he could observe that no one had mentioned any others, and that a man who invites 6 strangers to witness his private correspondence has a performance in mind. The boatman set Poirot's valise on the step and was gone again before Poirot had quite finished thanking him. The boat sliding back down the falling tide toward the mainland, growing small. Poirot watched it a moment. Then he picked up his valise and followed Miss Moore into the house. Inside, it was cool and smelled of beeswax and old paper, with under that, faint and not quite pleasant, the smell of a place that is kept shut more often than it is opened. Miss Moore led him through a hall hung with portraits, and Poirot found himself slowing. A painting near the staircase hung askew. He set down his valise and, with 2 fingers, restored it to the horizontal. He stepped back, considered it, and was content. Then he saw a second crooked frame further along, and a small line appeared between his brows. You will forgive me, he murmured, attending to that one as well. It is a small madness of mine. The world, it should be in order. When it is not, the eye complains, and then the mind cannot rest. The housekeeper despairs of those frames, said Miss Moore. They will not hang straight, however often she sets them. The house settles, she says. It shifts in the night. Indeed, said Poirot, who did not believe houses shifted in the night, and believed even less in housekeepers who said so. And the housekeeper she has served, Mr. Vale long? Mrs. Treen came with the house. She was here before Mr. Vale bought it, monsieur. She is part of the freehold, I sometimes think. There was no unkindness in it, only the flat report of a fact. She does not care for visitors. You will see little of her. They climbed, and as they climbed Miss Moore told him what manner of place this was, in the worn voice of a guide who has given the speech many times and stopped, hearing it herself. The builder, a Mr. Aldwyn, long dead, had been obsessed with the stages of a human life, and had given each one a room. She opened the doors as they passed, briefly, as one shows a museum. The nursery came first, painted floor to ceiling with stars and moons, and a thin gilt comet that ran around all 4 walls, and a rocking horse stood in the centre of it, with its paint worn down to the wood at the saddle, though Miss Moore said no child had ever slept there in all the years she knew of. There was a schoolroom kept exactly as it had stood in 1880, the slates still chalked, with a sum half worked, the inkwells dry, a globe in the corner showing an empire that had since changed its colours. There was a ballroom that took up half the seaward front, its floor a pale parquet never scuffed, its chandeliers swaddled in holland bags like things drowned. and Poirot stood a moment in the doorway of that great cold room and felt the particular melancholy of a place built for joy and never used for it. "And up there," said Miss Moore, with a small upward motion of her chin toward the next flight, "are the rooms of the later life. The courtroom Mr. Vale calls the library, and at the very top, beneath the eaves, the last room." "The last room," Poirot repeated. "In which there is what?" "Clocks, monsieur. A great many clocks. All of them stopped." She said it lightly, but her hand had found the banister. "The builder stopped them, that there at the last time should hold its breath. Or so the story runs. Stopped at what hour? I have never been told. I have never gone in." It came a little too quickly, and Poirot let it pass without comment, which is not at all the same as failing to notice. His own room was smaller and far more cheerful, with a window facing the rose gardens and the sea beyond them. Miss Moore showed him the bell, and the times of meals, and the chapel down by the gate, should he wish it, and went away with the same arranged half-smile, and Poirot was alone. He did not at once unpack. He stood a long while at the glass, watching the light lie gold across the water, and the causeway dwindle to a dark line, and then to nothing as the tide closed over it. When he turned at last to the room, he drew out the 4 letters and laid them on the writing table, squaring their edges with care, and read them in order, as if reading them on this island, in this house, might lend them a sense they had withheld in London. The first, in a fine sloping hand: "Can a man commit murder without killing anyone?" The second: "Can a stolen life be returned?" The third: "How many names may a man wear before he loses his own?" And the fourth, which was not a question, and held no other word: "If I die before Saturday, burn this invitation." Poirot did not burn it. He was an orderly man, and orderly men do not destroy evidence. The request itself he found significant, for a man who asks that a thing be burned has already imagined the hand that might wish to read it. He had instead packed a bag, made his apologies to Miss Lemon, who had disapproved with her whole back, and come. Hastings, had he been in England, would have called it folly. Poirot would have agreed, and come all the same. Some men write such letters to amuse themselves, and grow bored, and write no more. Some write them because they are afraid. And a frightened man who summons a detective is a man worth the journey. He meant to learn, before Saturday, which sort Sebastian Vale was. He squared the edges of the letters once more, and was about to turn away from the table, when his eye caught something on the wall above it. A small framed photograph, a view of the island taken from the sea, much as he himself had just approached it. And across its lower corner, in pencil, in a hand he did not yet know, someone had written a single line. He leaned close to read it, and for a moment went entirely still. "Welcome home, whoever you are." He stood looking at it a long time. Welcome home. As though the room had been waiting for him, or for someone, or for anyone at all who might be persuaded to occupy a name. He took it from its hook, turned it over, found nothing on the back, and hung it straight again, because his hand could not do otherwise. Then he went down to dinner, a little earlier than the bell, in order to watch the others arrive. Chapter 2. 7. Envelopes. Sebastian Vale came down to dinner the way a curtain comes up. The drawing-room had been murmuring for some minutes. The guests arranged about it, like pieces uncertain of their squares, when the doors opened and the novelist entered, and the murmuring stopped. He was tall, perhaps 60, silver at the temples, dressed with a carelessness so studied it must have cost an hour before the glass. His was the face of a man who had been photographed a great deal and had learned to like it. He spread his arms as though to gather the whole room to his chest. "My friends, how good of you to be kept." A curious word, kept. Poirot, who had taken up a position near the window with a glass of sherry. He had no intention of drinking, filed the word away behind his moustaches, and went on with what he had been doing, which was to study faces. There had been time, before the host descended, to learn a little. The French doors stood open to the rose gardens, and the evening came in warm and gold, and the seven of them had circled one another in the wary fashion of strangers who suspect they have more in common than they would like. Lady Imogen Ashcroft was the easiest to place and the hardest to read. A widow of considerable fortune, she wore her years and her diamonds with the same composure, and she spoke in the unhurried manner of a woman who has never in her life been interrupted. She had asked Poirot, on being introduced, whether he found country house weekends as tedious as she did, and had not waited for his answer, which told him a good deal. Only once, before dinner, did the composure slip. The young man with the camera, there is always a young man with a camera, raised it and asked, might he take a likeness of the party, all together, for a memento. Lady Imogen set down her glass. "I would rather you did not." Her voice had gone perfectly flat, and the chill of it cooled the whole corner of the room. The young man laughed, a little uncertainly, and made the camera disappear into his coat with a quick conjurer's motion, and the moment closed over. The young man was Felix Harrow, and Poirot had marked him already, because Felix Harrow wore gloves. Fine grey kid, immaculate, and he wore them as he drank, and as he gestured, and as he tucked the camera away. Poirot had known soldiers who hid their hands so, after the war, and pianists who guarded them, and a particular sort of man who had reason to leave no print of himself anywhere he went. Harrow was a stage magician by trade, a man who made his living by misdirection, and he talked a good deal, and laughed rather more than the jokes deserved. And his eyes, between the laughs, were never still. Beside him sat his daughter, Lucy, and here Poirot felt the small, unbidden warmth he was always at pains not to let interfere with his judgment, and which interfered nonetheless. She was perhaps 20, fair, with an open face, and the rare and disconcerting quality of seeming to mean exactly what she said and no more. She had thanked the maid by name. She had moved a footstool so that an older guest need not stretch for it. When Vale entered, she rose to meet him with plain, uncomplicated affection, crossing the room to take both his hands, and the great man's manner softened in a way that surprised Poirot, who had been prepared to find the host all performance. For one moment Sebastian Vale looked at the girl as though there were no audience in the world, and it was the only moment of the whole evening in which he appeared to forget he was being watched. He raised her. "More or less," murmured a voice at Poirot's elbow. It belonged to the Reverend Matthew Crane, a retired clergyman with kind eyes and a face the colour of good port. After her mother died, when the child was small, school fees, doctors, birthdays, the lot of it. There is a great deal of charity in Val, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever else there may be in him. He said it warmly, and then, as though the warmth had betrayed him into something, his hand strayed up to his breast pocket and rested there, pressing very gently against whatever lay within, and did not draw it out. Poirot understood that the Reverend kept his comfort close, and that it was not a theological one. "You know Mr. Vale well, mon père." "No man knows Vale well." The Reverend smiled, but the smile did not sit easily. "I knew him a little, once, in another part of my life. We have a thing or two in common, he and I. I confess I was surprised to be asked here. I am not sure I am glad of it." He looked into his glass. "But one does not refuse Sebastian Vale. One finds that one cannot." The last of the seven was an American, Nathan Bell, a broad-awed, forthright man of industry who shook hands, as though concluding a treaty, and laughed at the right moments, and asked the right questions. He had built something in Chicago, he said, and sold it, and built something else, and he spoke of money the way other men speak of the weather, as a thing that simply happens and must be discussed. Yet, whenever Vale addressed him directly, some small machinery seized in the man. A stillness came into the jaw. The eyes flicked, once, toward the door. Poirot had seen a great many frightened men in his career. He had not often seen a confident one frightened, and the sight held his attention as a flaw in a diamond holds the eye of a jeweller. And so they went in to dinner, ate at a long table laid with old silver, and for a time it was pleasant enough. Vale was an admirable host. He drew out the shy and quieted the loud. He told a story about a duchess and a parrot and a bishop's hat that even Poirot found genuinely funny, and told it without once seeming to perform it, which is the rarest skill a teller of stories can have. The wine was excellent. The roses breathed through the open doors. Lucy laughed at her guardian's tale until she had to set down her fork, and Vale watched her laugh with an expression Poirot could not quite name, something between pride and grief. Then, as the plates were cleared and the candles came into their own against the failing light, the host changed the temperature of the room. He reached beneath his chair and brought up a flat morocco case, and from it drew 7 envelopes and laid them on the cloth before him in a neat fan. They were of heavy cream paper, sealed with red wax, and on each was written a single name in that fine, sloping hand Poirot had come to know. Vale rose and went round the table himself, slowly, with the air of a priest distributing something sacramental, and set one envelope before each guest. Lady Imogen, the Reverend Crane, Nathan Bell, Felix Harrow, Lucy, Evelyn Moore, who had come in quietly to sit at the table's foot, and last of all, he set one before Poirot, and Poirot looked down and found, not his own name, but a blank. Vale returned to his place and surveyed them all with a bright and expectant cruelty, the look of a man who has arranged a surprise and is impatient for it to go off. "Tomorrow evening," he said, "I shall read you the first chapter of my memoirs. I have called it a true account, and so it shall be, the first true account of my life that has ever been set down anywhere by anyone. Before then, I would advise you to read what I have given you." He let the silence work. "Some of you may wish to read it more than once." No one opened an envelope. No one asked what it held. No one, Poirot observed with mounting interest, said a single word. And that was the most remarkable thing of all. To be handed a sealed envelope at a dinner table, with your own name upon it, in such company, and to feel no flicker of curiosity, is against the whole of human nature. Yet 7 people sat in flat defiance of it. They stared at the cream paper, the way a man stares at a letter whose contents he has already composed in the long privacy of his fear. Lady Imogen had gone the colour of her own pearls. Nathan Bell turned his envelope face down with one finger, as one covers a card. The Reverend's lips moved without sound. Felix Harrow had stopped talking, which Poirot would not have thought possible, and his gloved hand lay across his envelope and did not move from it. Evelyn Moore looked at hers as a servant looks at a thing she has been ordered to carry and would rather not touch. Only Lucy seemed merely puzzled. She turned hers over, read her own name, looked up at Vale with frank inquiry, opened her mouth to ask. And Vale gave the smallest shake of his head, and she subsided, frowning, and did not break the seal. The dinner ended soon after. There was no music, no cards, none of the easy dawdling of people glad of one another's company. The guests rose almost as one, and dispersed to their rooms, with the haste of people escaping rather than retiring. The envelopes carried before them, or thrust into pockets, and the great house gathered them in, room by room, and fell silent. Poirot did not sleep. The blank envelope troubled him, and the 7 that were not blank troubled him more. And toward midnight he put on his dressing gown and went down the dim corridor, because a methodical man cannot rest while a question lies unattended in the next room. The house was very dark and very still, and the portraits watched him pass, and somewhere a board creaked under no foot at all. That was when he saw the light. It came from beneath the door of the small writing room off the hall, the unsteady orange light of a fire, where no fire had any business being lit on a warm June night. He laid his hand flat against the door and pushed it open without a sound. The room was empty, but on the grate, curling and blackening at its edges, a single cream envelope was burning, the wax of its seal running red as it melted and dripping, slow, into the ash. The flames had it almost wholly. Poirot crossed the room in 3 quick steps and reached for the poker, meaning to rake it clear, and then stopped, his hand above it, and let it burn. There was nothing of it left to save. By the time he could lift the thing from the fire, it would be a black leaf that fell to dust at a breath. And whoever had set it there, whoever had stood at this grate, not 3 minutes since, and watched their own name consumed, had gone, out the far door, into the dark of the house, before Poirot's light had reached the corridor. He stood and watched it burn down to nothing, and wondered which of the 7 had read what was inside before feeding it to the flames, and which had burned it unread, too afraid of the contents to learn them. The first was a guilty act. The second, Poirot thought, was very nearly a braver one. He filed both possibilities and went up to bed, and lay a long while listening to the house settle and shift in the night, as the housekeeper had promised it would. Chapter 3. A light put out. By morning the grate held nothing but a thumbnail of grey ash, cold, and not one of the 7 would admit to having lit it. Poirot did not press them. He had learned long ago that a question asked too soon is a question wasted, that men brace against an inquiry and let slip everything when no inquiry seems to be coming. So he passed the day as an idle visitor passes a day in a strange and beautiful place. He strolled the rose gardens, which were very fine and very old, the bushes gone half wild and heavy with bloom. He admired the absurd turrets. He sat in the sun on the seaward wall, with a book he did not read, and once, following a flight of weathered steps cut into the cliff face below the terrace, he came down to a still green tidal pool the builder had hewn out of the living rock at the foot of the house, where the sea came and went through a low arched watergate, and where an old rusted door, half off its hinge, opened into the dark base of the house itself. He stood a while at the lip of that pool, looking at the door and at the smooth, deep water, and then climbed back up to the light and said nothing of it to anyone. And he watched a great deal. He watched Nathan Bell walk the causeway at low tide all the way out to its midpoint and stand there with his hands in his pockets, looking back at the island and then out at the mainland, like a man weighing a sum he cannot get to balance. He stood until the water began to creep grey across the stones at his feet, and then he turned and came back, unhurried, as though he had decided something or failed to. He watched the Reverend Crane go down to the little chapel by the gate and remain there the better part of an hour, and come out at last with his step a shade surer than it had gone in, his colour a shade higher, and his hand at his breast pocket. He watched Lady Imogen sit at the writing desk in the morning room and begin a letter and tear it across, and begin another and burn each one half finished at the candle she had lit for the purpose in broad day, until there were 3 small fires and 3 small heaps of ash and not one letter sent. And he watched Lucy Harrow on the terrace, teaching herself with great patience and no success to balance a coin on the back of her hand and flick it up and catch it, the way her father could, while Felix stood over her in his grey gloves and told her she was doing it wrong, and would not, even once, take off a glove and show her with his own bare fingers how it was done. "You hold it like a girl who's afraid of it," Felix said, not unkindly. "A coin is only a coin. It can't hurt you. You won't show me. I'm showing you now. You're telling me. You never show me." She let the coin fall and looked up at him, shading her eyes. "You've never once let me see your hands properly, Papa. Not since I was small. Why is that?" Felix laughed, his too easy laugh, and changed the subject, and Poirot, on the wall some distance off, marked it down. Of the envelopes, no one spoke. They had become, by some silent treaty among the 7, a subject that did not exist, that had never existed, that it would be the worst of bad manners to raise. And yet the whole house moved differently because of them, the way a room moves differently when there is a coffin in the next room and everyone has agreed not to mention it. Poirot noticed, too, that Evelyn Moore now carried a ring of keys at her waist that she had not carried the day before. He noticed that she kept to the upper floors, and that twice, in the course of the afternoon, she climbed the narrow stair toward the eaves and came down again some minutes later with the look of a woman who has been somewhere she would rather not be asked about. The second time, he was on the landing as she descended, and she started at the sight of him, and her hand closed over the keys to still them. "You go up often, mademoiselle," Poirot said mildly, "to the rooms of the later life." "Mr. Vale asked me to see that the library is ready for this evening, monsieur. The candles, the chairs. It came smoothly enough, but she had not been to the library, which was on the floor below, and they both knew it. "Is there something you require?" "Nothing in the world," said Poirot, and stepped aside, and let her go down past him, and did not turn to watch her go, though he heard her pause at the foot of the stair, as though to be certain he had not. The tide closed the causeway at 6:30, and the island became, as the boatman had promised, a thing that kept what it had. They assembled in the library at 9. The builder had called it his courtroom, and it had the air of one. A long, high room panelled in dark oak, the shelves climbing up out of the candlelight into a shadow that swallowed their tops, with a single heavy door and a row of tall windows along the seaward wall, giving on to the cliff and the black water below. Taking his seat, Poirot found his eye drawn, and then quietly offended by a small framed sea chart that hung beside the shelves and would not sit true upon its nail, however the candlelight steadied it. The oak panel behind it stood a hair's breadth proud of its fellows, as though the wood had warped, or as though something behind it had pushed it gently and permanently out of plumb. He thought of the crooked frames in the hall below, and of the housekeeper who said, "The house shifted in the night," and he entered, behind his moustaches, a small reservation against the housekeeper. Vale had arranged the chairs in a half-circle, as for an audience, and at the focus of them, on a small table, he had laid a thick manuscript bound about with string. He took his place behind it, and rested both hands flat upon the pages, and the candle flame stood up straight and unwavering in the still air, and Poirot, seated at the curve's end, where he might see every face at once, felt the whole room contract about that bound bundle of paper, the way a fist closes upon a coin. "You have all had the night to read what I gave you," Vale said. His voice filled the room without seeming to rise. "I shall not ask which of you did, and which of you could not bear to. It does not signify. After tonight there will be no secrets among us, for I have decided to become, for one evening only, the most honest man in England." His smile was wide and entirely without warmth, the smile of a man enjoying a private joke at the expense of everyone present. "I have lived a most remarkable life, my friends. I have lived several of them. Tonight you shall hear how." He untied the string. He drew the topmost page toward him. He looked round at them all, slowly, savouring the silence and their fear of it, the showman to the very last. "My name," he said, "is not Sebastian Vale," and the lights went out. It was not the failing of a lamp. It was total, and it was instant. Every candle in the room and every electric sconce in, the corridor beyond, extinguished in the same half-second, as though a single great hand had passed flat across the whole house and wiped it dark. The windows gave only a fainter blackness where the sea lay under the stars. For one heartbeat, no one moved. The room held its breath. Then it broke apart into sound. A chair went over with a crack of wood on wood. Someone close beside Poirot drew in a small, sharp, frightened breath. A woman cried out, a single high note that was cut off as if by a hand. There came a heavy stumble and a scrape. The little table struck and skidding on the boards, and the soft avalanche of papers sliding to the floor. And then, shockingly near, no more than a few feet from where Poirot sat, a flat, hard crack that every soul in the room knew at once, and that froze the blood in all of them together. The report of a pistol fired in a closed space. After it, a silence so complete that Poirot could hear the works of his own watch. He did not move from his chair. He was, of them all, the only one who did not move, for he had spent those black seconds, not in panic, but in the most intent listening of his life, knowing as he knew few things that what a man does in the dark when he believes himself unseen is the truest thing about him. He heard breathing, fast and shallow, from more than one quarter. He heard the soft, urgent friction of a body crossing the room, quick and low. He heard, very distinctly, the small oiled click of the door's latch. "Lumière," he said sharply into the black. "Light at once. Let no one leave the room, no one. You comprehend? No one is to move toward that door." A match flared at last, small and golden in the Reverend Crane's unsteady hand. By its light, the storm lamps were found on the side table where Evelyn had set them, and lit one after another, and the library swam slowly up out of the dark into a yellow, trembling clarity. The chairs stood in disorder, two of them overturned. Lady Imogen was on her feet, with one hand pressed to her throat, and the other gripping the back of a chair. Nathan Bell had braced himself against the bookshelves like a man on the pitching deck of a ship, his jaw set hard. The Reverend held his match until it burned his fingers, and he dropped it with a small exclamation. Evelyn Moore had her back flat to the panelled wall, white to the lips. Felix Harrow had flung one arm across his daughter, half shielding her, and Lucy's face above his sleeve was as white as the candles that no longer burned. Poirot counted the company. He counted it twice. It was short by one. The chair behind the little table stood empty. The manuscript was gone from the table, and Sebastian Vale was nowhere in the room. "The door," said Bell hoarsely, and they went to it together, Bell and Poirot, and the Reverend with a lamp held high. It was shut. When Bell seized the great iron handle and wrenched at it, it did not give, for it was locked, and the heavy key stood in the lock on the inside, turned full round, so that no hand in the corridor beyond could have drawn it out, nor pushed it through, nor reached the bolt at all. Poirot took the lamp and went along the row of tall windows, trying each catch in turn. Every one was latched from within, the brass catches stiff and grey, with the salt of years plainly undisturbed. One of them he could not even free with both hands, so welded was it by long neglect. Below the windows the cliff dropped sheer and clean to the moving water, 60 feet and more, with no ledge, no creeper, no possibility. There was no second door that any of them could see. There was, Evelyn whispered from the wall, no way out of this room that she had ever known in all her years in the house. Poirot said nothing to that. He had gone back to the great iron lock and laid 2 fingers against the key and against the wards beneath it, and when he drew his hand away and rubbed the fingertips slowly together, they were faintly slick. The lock had been oiled, and lately, and with care. A living man had stood before them in a sealed room. The light had failed for perhaps 20 seconds, no more. A shot had been fired, and in that brief darkness Sebastian Vale, together with his manuscript and the confession he had been about to make, had simply ceased to be among them, leaving behind a door locked upon its own inner side. A row of windows that had not been opened in a generation, and 7 witnesses, who would swear before any court in the land that no living soul had passed out of that room. Poirot stood in the centre of the disordered chairs and turned slowly upon his heel, the lamp in his hand throwing the long shadows of the chair legs wheeling across the floor. He took it all in. The locked door, the welded catches, the empty seat, the small ravelled end of string lying on the table where a life's true account had been. He was very calm. Beneath the calm he was more disturbed than he had been in many years. Not by the impossibility of the thing, for he did not believe in impossibilities, but by the patience of its design, the cold, long forethought of it. "This," he said at last, softly, "to no one and to all of them, has been arranged, and not, I think, by the dead." No one answered him. They searched the house until dawn. Every room of the 7 stages, every cupboard, every cellar, the chapel, the stables, the cold, swaddled ballroom, and found in all of them only dust and the smell of the sea, and one another's frightened faces, and nowhere any trace of the man who had vanished. Only one door in the whole house stood against them that night, high under the eaves, locked and not to be opened, and at the hour they reached it, weary and unstrung, it seemed to none of them worth the labour of breaking down. Chapter 4. 11:17. The last room lay at the very top of the house, beneath the eaves, behind a door that would not open. They came to it as the sky greyed toward morning, the whole exhausted party trailing up the narrow stair, with the storm lamps guttering low in their hands, having searched every other corner of St. Aldwyn's and found nothing in any of them. It was a strange stair, this one, narrow and windowless, walled in plain plaster, winding up through the very heart of the house, quite separate from the grand staircase the guests used, the builder's own private way. Evelyn had called it once, that ran from the cellars to the eaves, and was hardly used from one year to the next. It went down, too, past the doors of the sleeping floors, into a darkness below that none of them troubled, that night, to follow to its bottom. Nathan Bell, who had taken charge of the searching by force of nature, tried the handle at the top of it, and swore. Locked. He stooped to the keyhole with a lamp and straightened. Keys in it. On the far side. Turned. He looked round at the gaunt circle of faces on the stair below him. Same as the library, locked from within. By a dead man, I suppose, since we've half of us decided he's dead. "Or for one," said Poirot quietly, from a few steps down. It took the American 3 blows of his heavy shoulder to break the lock from its old seating, the wood splintering at the jamb, and the door swung in upon a room Poirot would not soon forget. It was small and low, close under the slope of the roof, and every surface in it bore a clock. There were clocks on the mantel, and clocks on the shelves, and clocks on the little tables. A long case clock stood in the corner, with its pendulum hanging dead. There were carriage clocks and bracket clocks in dull gilt, a black marble clock shaped like a temple, and a tiny gilt clock no bigger than a thimble set on the windowsill. Not one of them ticked. The builder, in his strange devotion, had stopped them all, every one, that here at the last of his stages, time itself should hold its breath. The air was dry and stale, and very still, the air of a room kept shut for years. And the pale dawn, coming grey through the single sealed window, fell across Sebastian Vale, who lay upon the bare floor, with his face turned up to the ceiling and his life some hours behind him. Lucy made a small sound, low in her throat. The Reverend drew her gently back from the threshold, turning her face into his shoulder. Poirot went forward alone. He knelt beside the body, careful of the skirts of his coat, and looked at the dead man without touching him, and what he saw arranged itself in his mind slowly, with the inevitability of a key turning in a well-made lock. There was no wound. For all the pistol crack that had frozen them in the dark, there was no mark of any shot upon him. No blood, no torn cloth, nothing. And yet the man had not died gently. About his lips and his nostrils there clung a fine pale froth, dried now to a brittle crust. His face wore the dark, suffused, swollen look that Poirot had seen before, more than once, upon men drawn too late from the Seine. Poirot leaned closer. The dead man's hair, at the back of the head, was stiff and faintly crusted. He touched it with the tip of one finger and brought the finger to his lips, and tasted, unmistakably, salt. The collar of the shirt, where it met the neck, was damp with it still, and the floor beneath the body was dry as old paper. The window was latched. The sea lay 60 feet below the cliff. A man drowned in salt water, in a sealed room at the top of a house, in which there was no water at all. His heart, surely, offered the Reverend faintly from the doorway. A man of his years, the shock, the excitement, his heart gave out, and he stopped, having nowhere to take the sentence. Men do not foam at the mouth when the heart fails, mon père, said Poirot, not unkindly. Men foam at the mouth when the lungs are full. He did not say full of what. There was no need. He rose, his knees protesting, and as he rose the clocks caught his eye again, and he went still. He moved from one to the next. The long case, the black temple, the bracket clock, the little gilt thimble on the sill, bending to read each silent face in the grey light, and with each one his stillness deepened. Then he turned to Evelyn Moore, who hung white and trembling at the broken door. Mademoiselle, these clocks. They were stopped, you told me, long ago. By the builder, years before ever I came here, monsieur. I told you, it is only a story. Then consider with me. He spread one hand toward the silent ranks of dials. A clock that is stopped, mademoiselle, stops at the moment its spring dies, or its weight runs to the floor, or the hand that wins it forgets or refuses to. Each in its own hour, you understand. This one at noon, that one at midnight, another at some forgotten hour of an afternoon long gone. A room full of clocks left to die on their own would show a room full of different hours, as a churchyard shows 100 different days upon its stones. He paused, and his voice dropped. Regardez, every clock in this room shows 17 minutes past 11, every single one, to the minute. The long case, which has not gone in 20 years, the little one on the sill, whose spring is rusted solid. All of them, 17 minutes past 11. No one spoke. The dawn brightened by a degree at the window. They did not stop together, Poirot said softly. They were set together, each one moved by hand to the same hour, by someone who wished, very particularly, that we should come into this room and read that hour and remember it. 11 and 17. It is a message, or it is a lie dressed as a message. I do not yet know which, but I shall. It was as they stood staring at the clocks, the 11:17 repeated all about them like a cord held too long. that Poirot saw the paper. It lay half beneath the dead man's shoulder, a corner of it just showing, and he drew it out from under the body's weight with 2 careful fingers. It was a child's drawing on a sheet of cheap, rough paper gone soft and yellow with age, the kind of paper a school gives out by the ream and thinks nothing of. A house had been crayoned upon it, a crude, lopsided house, leaning like the manor itself, with a great black door taking up half its front. And before the house stood 7 stick figures in a row, drawn in the unsteady hand of a small child, each with a round head and 2 dot eyes, and a single fixed upward line for a smile. Beneath them, printed in clumsy capital letters, pressed down so hard that in places the crayon had torn clean through the paper, ran a single sentence: "Don't let him change his name again." "Good heavens," said Belle, peering over Poirot's shoulder. "A child's scribble. He must have kept it about him for some sentimental reason of his own. It can mean nothing, surely." "A nursery picture," agreed the Reverend, and crossed himself. "Poor fellow! Poor fellow! Throw the dreadful thing away," said Lady Imogen from the stair, and turned her face aside. Poirot looked at the 7 smiling figures and the 7 torn black words, and he folded the paper once, along a soft crease it had plainly known many times before, and put it away in his breast pocket. As you say, it can mean nothing at all. He did not believe that for a single instant. And the eagerness of their dismissals interested him very nearly as much as the drawing itself, for it is a curious company, indeed, that will agree, all at once, and with such warmth and such relief, that a thing found beneath the body of a murdered man is not worth a second glance. He stepped back into the broken doorway, and from there, in the strengthening light, he read their faces, one by one, the way another man reads a printed page. Lady Imogen had gone the colour of ash and put out a hand to the wall of the stair to steady herself, like a woman who has seen the one thing she most dreaded, made suddenly and finally real. Nathan Bell was not grieved. Bell was angry, a hard, hot, baffled anger that worked in the muscles of his jaw and found no words to spend itself on. The Reverend Crane had bowed his head, and his lips were moving in prayer, and his hand, Poirot noted, had gone to his breast pocket, even in the middle of his praying. Felix Harrow had begun to talk, lightly, almost gaily, a fast, bright stream of nervous pleasantry about coroners and tides, and what on earth they should all do about breakfast. Far too much of it, and far too quick, the patter of a man who cannot endure a silence because of what the silence might contain. Evelyn Moore wept, quietly, without any performance in it, her face working, and her grief at least had to Poirot's ear the unmistakable ring of the genuine. And Lucy Harrow, pale but quite composed now, asked the strangest question Poirot had heard put in a long and curious career. "Which name?" she said, looking down at the body and not at any of them, "was he using when he died?" Not one of them answered her, and not one of them, Poirot saw, found the question strange. They received it as one receives a remark, whose sense everyone present already understands. Only Poirot turned his egg-shaped head and looked at the girl with a new and very careful attention, and felt the first cold thread of the truth pass cleanly through his fingers. He looked once more about the room. The dry floor, the sealed window, The 7 smiling figures folded away against his heart. The 17 past 11 repeated upon a dozen dead and silent faces. "My friends," he said at last, "I must tell you a thing that you will not wish to hear. This is not the murder of a man. He let it stand a moment in the grey air. It is the murder of a name." Chapter 5. The wrong questions Inspector Pengelly had crossed the causeway expecting the great detective to take a consuming interest in the corpse, and was disappointed within the hour. He was a square, sandy man of the Cornish County Constabulary, slow of speech and not at all slow of mind. And he had come over the wet stones the moment the morning tide drew back, with his sergeant and the police surgeon trudging behind him, and the surgeon complaining of the walk. Pengelly had heard of Poirot, as who in England had not, and had prepared himself on the crossing to be either patronised or assisted, and had not been ready to be, in effect, ignored. For Poirot, having taken him up to the last room and shown him the dry floor and the salt upon the dead man's collar, and let him exclaim, like everyone else, over the dreadful conformity of the clocks, thereafter declined to climb the stairs again at all. "You'll not want another look at it, monsieur," said Pengelly, baffled, on the landing. "The window catches, the way of the lock, the whole manner of the thing. It's the queerest scene I've stood in 22 years of this work. And you've turned your back on it. The window will say the same thing tomorrow as it says today," said Poirot serenely, drawing on his gloves with great precision, finger by finger. "It cannot lie, the window, and so it cannot be caught lying. And so it is for me of small use. People, Inspector, are of more use. People lie, and in their lies they tell me everything I most wish to know." He smoothed the second glove. "You shall measure the room. You shall photograph the catches and test the lock, and do all the excellent things your training has taught you, and I am very glad you are here to do them. I shall measure the persons. Between us, I think, we shall arrive." So, while the surgeon did his sombre work above, and the sergeant crawled about the floor of the last room with a tape, and Pengelly grew by slow degrees, more and more impatient, Hercule Poirot established himself in the morning room with its pleasant view of the roses, and sent for the living one at a time, and asked of each of them a question that had nothing whatever to do with murder. To Lady Imogen Ashcroft, who came in with her composure repaired, and her diamonds back upon her hands, he said, when she had arranged herself in the chair, "Madame, I shall not trouble you about last night. The dark, the noise, the confusion. You saw nothing, as none of us saw anything, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I wish to know only one small thing, a thing of no importance. What was your first surname?" She had braced every nerve for an accusation, and a question so small, so domestic, so apparently idle, undid her more thoroughly than any charge could have done. There was a pause that lasted a fraction of a second too long. "Ashcroft is my married name, of course," she said. "Before I married Sir Henry Ashcroft, I was a Vane." "Vane," said Poirot, as though tasting it. "And before that, madame, before you were a Vane." "There is no before that, Monsieur Poirot. One is born with a name. Mine was Vane." But her hand had closed hard upon the carved arm of the chair, the knuckles standing white through the skin, which was precisely the thing Poirot had asked the question in order to watch, and he thanked her with great courtesy and let her go. Nathan Bell came next, and would not sit, but stood in the doorway, and rather filled it, all breadth and certainty, and a slight aggressive forward lean. "Make it quick, Mr. Poirot. There's a man dead upstairs, and a policeman crawling round the floor, and I'd as soon be doing something useful." "Of course. One question only, Mr. Bell, and then you are free." Poirot regarded him pleasantly over his folded hands. "When did you stop stuttering?" The American's face did a most remarkable thing. For the space of a single instant, the confidence ran straight off it, the way water runs off oiled glass, and underneath the confidence Poirot saw, quite clearly, a younger and a poorer and a badly frightened man. Then the shutter came down, and the confidence flooded back, too late. "I never stuttered in my life," said Bell, far too quickly and a good deal too loud. "Who told you that? Whoever told you that is a liar. Forgive me. I was misinformed." Poirot smiled and inclined his head and let him stand there a moment in his own denial. He had not, in fact, been misinformed by anyone. He had been guessing on the evidence of a man who chose his words, the precise, careful way that a cured stammerer chooses his, steering always around the consonants that would betray him. Never once in 2 days saying a word that began hard when a soft one would serve. The denial, with its heat and its haste, told Poirot a great deal more than any honest answer would have done. "That is all, Mr. Bell. Thank you. You may go and be useful." Felix Harrow arrived already in the middle of a sentence, something about the tide and the coroner, and how dreadful it all was. And Poirot let him talk, let the bright, nervous patter run on for a minute and more, and then dropped his question into the middle of it, the way a man slips his hand into a running stream. "Monsieur Harrow, in all your long years upon the stage, what is the one illusion you have never managed to master?" The patter stopped, as if cut with shears. The gloved hands, which had been describing something in the air, went quite still and settled into his lap. "Now, that," said Felix, and the easy smile thinned at the edges, "is a professional secret, Monsieur Poirot. Every conjurer alive has the one trick he cannot do. We do not speak of it." He gathered himself, and the lightness came back, a little forced. "But I'll tell you mine, since you ask so prettily. The floating lady. I have never managed her, not once in 30 years. It's the wires, you see. I cannot abide wires. I have never been able to trust a thing that hangs by a wire." "And the vanishing man?" said Poirot, very gently, watching the gloves. "Him you have mastered, I think." Felix Harrow looked at him for a long, long moment and said nothing at all, and the smile died altogether. And presently he rose and made some excuse and took himself out of the room. And the grey gloves, Poirot observed, did not once leave his lap from the first question to the last. Evelyn Moore he treated more gently than the rest, for her grief still hung about her like a wet coat and seemed to him real. "Mademoiselle, you served Mr. Vale faithfully, and for some years. Tell me, if you can, who taught him to write?" She blinked at him through reddened eyes. "He was a great writer, monsieur, one of the great writers of the age. No one taught him. He had the gift in him from the first." "Ah, but I do not speak of his books, mademoiselle. I do not speak of the gift. I speak of his hand, the actual forming of the letters, the fine sloping copperplate of all his private correspondence. of those 7 envelopes. It is a trained hand, mademoiselle. An old-fashioned hand, a charity school hand, the hand they beat into a boy, with a ruler across the knuckles in a poor institution. 40 years ago, when penmanship was a thing the deserving poor were given in place of much else. A man is not born writing so. Somewhere there stood over him a patient and a pitiless master. Do you know where? Do you know anything at all of where Sebastian Vale was a boy? Evelyn did not. She had never thought to ask. Great men, she said, came from nowhere and everywhere. It was part of their greatness. But Poirot saw that his question had opened a small door somewhere inside her, behind which sat a thing she had served beside for years, and never once turned to look at. And he marked the opening of that door, and let her go to her weeping. And last of all he sent for Lucy Harrow. She came in quietly, and sat without being asked, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with that clear and untroubled and faintly disconcerting gaze of hers. And Poirot felt again the unwilling warmth he distrusted in himself, and could not be rid of. He had meant to be careful with her, and shrewd, and to learn from her what he had learned from the rest by stealth. He found, somewhat to his own annoyance, that what he chiefly wished was to be kind. Mademoiselle Lucy, you loved Mr. Vale, I think. He was good to you, when there were perhaps not so very many who were good to you. He was the best man I knew, she said simply. There was no defiance in it, and no doubt, only a flat report of the truth, as she had always held it. Then I shall ask you only this one thing. He leaned forward a little. When did he first tell you a lie? He had fully expected her to deny it, to flush and protest, as every other person that morning had denied the small thing he had reached for, with the swift, reflexive indignation of the loyal. She did not. She received the question as though it were an entirely fair one, which, Poirot thought, watching her, it was, and turned it over honestly in her mind, taking her time, and when she answered, her voice was very steady and very low. On the day he told me my parents had loved me, she said, I was 7 years old. I knew even then that it wasn't true, though I couldn't have told you how I knew. But it was a kind lie, Monsieur Poirot. He told it to me because the truth would have hurt a child, and he could not bear for me to be hurt. I have been grateful for it all my life. She raised her clear eyes to his, and there was the faintest line of trouble in them now, the first he had seen there. Why do you ask me that, of all things? Do you think the kind ones count? The kind lies? Poirot did not answer at once. Outside the window, the gulls cried and wheeled over the heavy roses. Above his head, the floorboards creaked under the surgeon's slow tread, and Pengalee's impatient voice came thin and querulous down the stairwell, demanding something of the sergeant. He looked at the girl with the open, honest face, and the 7 crayoned stick figures rose all at once before his mind's eye, and he felt the cold thread he had first touched in the last room draw quietly tighter. I think, mademoiselle, he said slowly, that the kind ones count for the very most of all. When she had gone, he sat alone for a long while, and took the child's drawing from his pocket, and unfolded it, and laid it square upon the table before him in the morning light. 7 small smiling figures in a row before a black door. He had now spoken with 7 people in this house. 7 envelopes had been given out at dinner. The arithmetic was very tidy. It was, Poirot thought, frowning down at the worn paper. A great deal too tidy by half. And a thing that is too tidy is a thing that has been arranged by a careful hand, and he did not yet see whose. He was still sitting so, gazing at the 7 figures, when Inspector Pengelly came down the stairs at last, red in the face and lit up with triumph, to announce that he had found, in the writing case of Lady Imogen Ashcroft, the plain black and white proof of exactly why she had every reason in the world to wish Sebastian Vale dead. Chapter 6. The first person he became very well. I did it. The fraud, the false accounts, the ruin of all those people. Everything your inspector has dug out of my writing case is true, and I will not waste your time pretending it is not. Lady Imogen Ashcroft sat very straight in the morning room, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The diamonds were gone from them now, and without the diamonds she looked older, and, Poirot thought, a very great deal more honest. But I did not put out the lights last night, Monsieur Poirot, and I did not kill that man. I have wanted to kill him for 30 years, and I find now, when someone has done it for me, that I feel nothing at all. On the table between them lay the contents of her writing case, spread out there in evidence by the triumphant Pengelly, who stood by the door with his thumbs in his waistcoat. A sheaf of yellowed letters in a hand that was not her own, all of them addressed to a Mrs. Vane, and beneath the letters the proof. Brittle press cuttings, 30 years old, of a company looted and folded, of small investors ruined, of a name dragged through every newspaper in the country, and a man who had vanished one morning ahead of the warrant. "You knew him," said Poirot, "before, not as Sebastian Vale." "I knew him when he called himself Edmund Vane and signed cheques that were not his to sign," she said. "He was my husband, monsieur, for 2 years. We were married in a registry office in Bristol in the spring, and he was charming and clever, and I was 23, and I thought myself the luckiest woman in England. Then one grey morning in November he was simply gone, and the company was gone with him, and the savings of 400 small, careful people were gone, and I was left standing in the wreck of it to answer the questions, because I was the only one left with a face the creditors could find." She laughed, a short, dry sound, with no joy anywhere in it. I took back my maiden name. I let it be understood that poor Mrs. Vane had died of the disgrace. In time I married Sir Henry Ashcroft, who was kind and dull, and never once asked me a question I could not answer. I buried Edmund Vane so deep that on most days of my life I half believed in his death myself. And then, 3 weeks ago, a famous and beloved novelist, whom I had never met, sent me a thick cream envelope, and inside it was my own marriage certificate, 30 years old, from a registry office in Bristol. And I understood, all in a moment, that the dead have a way of writing books. Pengelly stirred by the door. "There it is, monsieur, plain as day. She lied to your very face about ever knowing the man. She had the fear of exposure on her. She had the oldest, blackest motive there is. I don't see what more a jury could ask." "She had the motive of yesterday, Inspector," said Poirot mildly, "which is by no means the same thing as the motive of last night." He turned one of the yellowed cuttings to the light and tapped it with a fingernail. "Regard this, I beg you. This scandal, it was tried in the newspapers. 30 years ago, all England read of the looted company and the ruined widow and the swindler who fled. There is no secret here. There is only a very old wound that has been healing a long time. He folded the cutting closed with care. A man cannot blackmail you, madame, with a thing that the entire world already knows. I ask you plainly, what had you to fear from this memoir of his? It could tell only what the courts and the newspapers had told already half a lifetime ago. Over you, Sebastian Vale held no power at all, none whatever, and a woman of your intelligence does not murder a man in the dark, at terrible risk, in a houseful of witnesses, in order to silence a story that every soul in England has long since read and forgotten. Lady Imogen looked at him for a moment, as though he had quietly reached out and unfastened a stay. She had worn so long she had forgotten its weight and could suddenly breathe. "No," she said softly. "No, he had no power over me. That was the strange, cold comfort of it, monsieur, the thing I could not say to any of the others. Of all the frightened people gathered under this roof, I think I was the only one who could look across the dinner table at Sebastian Vale and feel nothing in the world but contempt. He had used me up so long ago that there was nothing left in me for him to threaten." "Of all of them," Poirot repeated, and the phrase lodged in him and would not be shaken loose. For if the secret of one guest was a spent and harmless thing, an old wound long since aired, then it followed that the true danger of this house lay in the secrets that were not spent, the ones that were still living, still capable of utter ruin, still worth a death in the dark to keep. And one of the people who had sat at that long table had stared down at a sealed cream envelope, with the white, fixed face of the truly and presently afraid. Pengelly went away grumbling, wholly unconvinced, to walk down to the boatman's cottage and telephone the mainland. And Poirot, who wished very much to think, went out into the gardens. He found Lucy Harrow alone on the low seaward wall above the water, throwing crumbs from her pocket to the wheeling gulls, and he sat down beside her without ceremony, settling his small, neat person on the warm stone. And, for a while, neither of them said anything at all. "You have taught yourself the trick of the coin yet?" he asked at last. She smiled without looking round. "Never. I never shall. Papa says I have honest hands, and that in our family it is not a compliment." She watched a gull tip sideways on the wind and slide away down the cliff. "You want to ask me more about Sebastian. Everyone is so dreadfully careful with me, monsieur. They lower their voices, and they will not say his name in front of me, as though I were made of something that breaks. I shan't break. I knew him far too long for that." "How long, mademoiselle?" "Always. For as long as I can remember anything, he was simply there." She was quiet a moment. "My mother died when I was very small, too small to keep her face, though I have tried. And after that, it was Sebastian who came. He paid for my schooling, every term of it, the good school, with the cold dormitories. He never forgot a single birthday in 20 years, never once, not even the years he was abroad. When I was lonely at school, and I was very lonely, he wrote me long funny letters about nothing at all, about a cat he had seen, wearing an expression of great political ambition, about the absurd hat of a woman on a train, and I kept every one of them, all of them, in a biscuit tin under my bed." She paused, and her voice changed, going somewhere far off. "He taught me to read, sitting on the floor of the old nursery, the one with the stars on the walls, and he taught me to swim. Here, off these very rocks below us, the summer I turned 9. He said a person who could not swim was forever at the mercy of the sea, and he could not bear, he said, to be at anyone's mercy, not anyone's, not ever. Poirot looked down at the water moving below them, grey and patient, and very deep, sliding up the black rock and falling back. You loved him, he said. Everyone loved him. And she said it, this time with a curious new flatness, looking not at Poirot, but straight out at the hard line of the horizon. That is the thing I have been turning over and over, all the night long, monsieur, and I cannot make it come out right, however I work at it. Everyone who knew Sebastian loved him. He was the kindest man, the most generous, the most delightful man in any room he ever walked into. Ask any one of them in that house, and they will tell you the same. She drew a slow breath, and her folded hands tightened in her lap. And every single one of them, who knew him longest, was afraid of him. I have only understood it since last night, that those two things are not opposites at all. They are the same thing. You cannot be so kind to so many people for so many years unless you have first taken the trouble to learn exactly what each one of them is most ashamed of in all the world. Kindness and knowledge, Monsieur Poirot. He had a very great deal of both, and I am no longer at all sure whether one of them ended in him and the other one began. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. He understood now the true shape and engine of the dead man's power over a roomful of people. And it was not his money, nor his fame, nor his charm, though he had worn all three of those like well-cut coats. It was that he knew things. He had spent a whole long life gathering up the secret shames of other people, the way another man gathers postage stamps, patiently, into albums, and a guest list of 7 careful names was in truth nothing more, nor less than a private gallery of his finest pieces. Mademoiselle, he said gently after a while, when he taught you to swim off these rocks, the summer you were 9 years old, who else was there with you, on the beach below? Your father, perhaps. She turned and looked at him then, and for the very first time something moved behind the clear eyes. Something quick and deep and instantly suppressed, gone again before he could put a name to it. No one, she said. There was no one. It was always only the two of us down there, Sebastian and me. And she rose and brushed the last of the crumbs from her skirt and went up the slope toward the house with her unhurried walk, leaving Poirot alone on the wall with the gulls and the deep grey water. And a question he had not, until he heard her answer it, quite known that he was asking. He returned to his own room as the afternoon light began to fail, and found that someone had been there before him. On the writing table, squared neatly to the very edge, with a precision that seemed almost to mock his own small habit, lay a single sheet of paper. It was a page of manuscript, typewritten. The only page he had seen, or anyone had seen, of the memoir that had vanished from the locked library. At its head stood the words, Chapter 1. Below them was one paragraph, and one only, and the great expanse of the page beneath it was bare. He read it standing, without troubling to take off his coat. The first person I became was a dead boy. That was the whole of it. No name, no date, no word of explanation. The sentence sat alone on the white page like a single footprint in snow. Poirot read it once, and then again, and then a third time, and then he sat down slowly in the chair by the window and laid the typed page carefully beside the child's crayon drawing. The 7 smiling figures and the single typed line, side by side now in the last grey light of the day, and he had very distinctly the sense that the house had at last begun to tell him the truth of itself, in the only way such a house can, and that he did not yet have quite the wit to hear the whole of what it said. Chapter 7. The survivors there remained one envelope in all that house which no one had opened, and it was his own. He had carried it about with him since the first dinner. The blank one, the cream envelope sealed with red wax that bore no name at all upon its face, and he had not broken the seal. This was not negligence in him, and it was not forgetfulness. A methodical man does not open a thing until he is ready to understand what he will find inside it. For a clue read too early is a clue almost certain to be misread, fitted by an impatient mind into the wrong place in the wrong frame. And Poirot had wished first to know the shape of the house, and the faces in it, and the weight of the silences between them. Now, alone in his room with the child's drawing, and the single typed page laid out before him, and the long June dusk gone violet over the sea. Beyond the glass, he judged himself at last ready. He took up the small ivory paper knife from the writing table, slit the wax with one clean, unhurried motion, and drew out what lay inside. It was a photograph, an old one, faded all over to the soft brown colour of weak tea, its corners gone furry and round, with much handling over many years. It showed the front steps of a tall, grim institutional building, gabled and joyless, of the sort that the Victorians built for the housing of those they wished to help and did not wish to see, and ranged upon the steps in 2 careful rows, marshalled by some hand outside the frame, stood a company of children in the shapeless grey uniform of charity. Boys and girls together, scrubbed raw, hair flattened with water, every one of them squinting and unsmiling into a long ago and forgotten sun. Poirot counted them, touching each small grey figure in turn with the very tip of one finger. There were 8. He turned the photograph over in his hands, across the back, in faded brown ink, in that fine, sloping copperplate of the old charity schools, that he now knew better than he knew his own, were written 2 words, and no more: the survivors. He turned it back to the front, and it was then that he saw the thing his counting had so very nearly let him pass over altogether. For the eye is a lazy organ, and supplies without asking what it has been taught to expect. One of the 8 children was not a child at all. One of them was a neat oval hole, snipped clean out of the card, with a small, sharp pair of scissors, so carefully, so deliberately, so completely, that the face which had once been there might never have existed in the world at all. 7 children looked out at Hercule Poirot from the faded steps. The 8th was an absence, cut in the exact shape of a small bowed head. Poirot sat very, very still in the failing light, and it came to him then. Not in a flash, he distrusted flashes, and the men who relied on them, but as a dozen things he had held apart for 2 days quietly came together. The trained charity school hand that no master had ever stood over a born gentleman to give him. The typed line: "The first person I became was a dead boy." The letters, with their stolen life, and their question of how many names a man might wear. Lady Imogen's husband, who had been Edmund Vane, And then, one November morning had ceased to be. Belle, who chose each word like a man setting his foot on thin ice. The Reverend's comfort pressed close to a frightened heart, and the drawing, with its black door and its row of small fixed smiles, and the 7 words torn so hard the crayon had broken. Don't let him change his name again. He understood the dead man, finally and wholly. Sebastian Vale had been a child upon those grey steps. There had been a fire. The records of such places burn so conveniently, and a building full of the unwanted is one that no one inspects too closely afterward. In the smoke and the grief and the drifting ash, no one in authority could any longer say which scorched and shivering child was which, and one boy among them, cleverer than his keepers and a great deal colder, had seen in that ruin the whole shape of his life laid suddenly open. A dead child needs no name. A dead child's name is a door left standing open, and beyond it lies whatever that child might have inherited, or grown into, or escaped to. The boy walked through one such door. When the life beyond it grew dangerous, or merely dull, he found another, and then another, shedding each self as it served its turn, climbing always upward, until the nameless orphan who had begun the climb was buried too many selves deep to be found. Edmund Vane, the swindler, had been one door. Before Vane, some other. After Vane, others still, on and up, until at the last he stood in a house upon a cliff as the great Sebastian Vale, beloved novelist, admired and feared and courted, and from the soles of his shoes to the silver at his temples entirely invented. And the 7 guests. Poirot saw now why no 2 of them had ever told the same tale of the man's youth, why each had stared at a sealed envelope, as a condemned man stares at the priest. Each had known a different one of his lives. Lady Imogen had married one man. Belle had been ruined by, and had paid for 20 years, another. The Reverend had perhaps confessed, and absolved a third. And not one of them had ever suspected, across all the long years, that the others in that drawing-room had known and feared the very same creature under another face. He had gathered them here, all the surviving cast of his separate lives, to learn from his own lips that they had every one of them bowed before the same idol. It was no confession. A man who summons the people he has wronged so that they may applaud him does not repent of anything. But the old photograph held one thing, that the memoir Poirot would have staked his reputation was never going to tell them. 8 children had survived that fire, not 7. The drawing showed 7 figures. The memoir, he had no doubt, counted 7. The dead man's whole account of himself was built upon the number 7. But the camera does not flatter and does not forget, and that long ago, squinting morning on the steps, it had caught 8. And someone since, quite recently, the cut edges of the card still sharp, had taken a small pair of scissors to one face and removed it entirely from the record of the living, and laid the mutilated photograph inside the one envelope in the house that bore no name. The envelope meant for the single guest who could be relied upon to understand what it showed. The missing child mattered more than all the rest of them together, for the missing child was the one survivor of St. Aldwyn's whom the glittering story of Sebastian Vale had simply, deliberately, lovingly erased. He went down at once and found Inspector Pengelly in the dim hall, the man just back from the boatman's cottage and the telephone. and Pengelly, who had spent a long and fruitless afternoon being unconvinced of everything. Poirot said, looked up at the little detective's face, and rose at once to his feet, hope kindling. Inspector, the tide, it is out? For the next 2 hours and a bit, monsieur. Then she covers. Again. Then I beg of you, send your sergeant across the moment he can walk it, and let him telegraph the mainland tonight, before we lose the road. I want the records of an orphanage, a charity institution for children, that was destroyed by fire some 30 years ago. The county I do not yet know, but the name of the place will be stitched or printed upon the breast of a charity uniform, and a uniform may be read through a strong glass, and I shall read it for him before he goes. He drew breath, and his voice fell, and Pengelly leaned in close to catch the last of it. And I want more than the place, Inspector. I want the names. I want the names of all the children who died in that fire. He paused. And, above everything else, I want the names of the children who lived. You think, said Pengelly slowly, working it through, that one of them is here, under this roof. One of the 7. Poirot looked up the wide, dark staircase toward the upper floors, where 7 living souls were even now dressing, without appetite, for a dinner that none of them wished to eat. I think, he said very quietly, that there is in this house a child whom the whole world was persuaded to forget to count. And I think, Inspector, I am very much afraid that she has at last remembered herself. Chapter 8. What the camera kept. By lamplight, in the dark panelled room, the mad builder had called his courtroom. Hercule Poirot laid out the many faces of one dead man. He had spent the long afternoon and the early evening in the gathering of them. Evelyn Moore, when he had explained to her a very little of what he was looking for, had brought him, without a word, a whole portfolio of the publicity portraits of the great Sebastian Vale, silver-haired, faintly amused, immaculately careless, a dozen of them, taken by famous photographers across the years of his fame, for dust jackets and for the literary pages of the newspapers. From the writing case of Lady Imogen, he had borrowed the brittle, yellowed press cutting of Edmund Vane, swindler, photographed on the steps of a Bristol courthouse he had taken great care never to be made to enter. A younger, leaner, clean-shaven man, his collar a different cut, his hair parted on the other side. And Nathan Bell, pressed pale and stiff into a chair and made at last to speak, had surrendered from a hidden fold of his pocketbook a single small snapshot of a man he had known in Chicago a long time ago, under yet a third name, a man who had ruined him in a business deal, and to whom Bell had paid, faithfully and in secret, every year for 20 years, a sum of money to keep certain papers from certain people. And in the very centre of all these, like a coin around which others are arranged, Poirot set the oldest face of all, the orphanage photograph, with its 8 grey children and its one small, clean oval wound where the 8th had been. 4 faces, different names, different decades, different cities, different countries. A beard in one of them, in another, gold spectacles and a stoop. In a third, the full unlined cheeks of a man, not yet 30, and the hard, bright stare of one with everything still to win. The disguises were the work of a master, patient and unhurried, perfected over a lifetime. A lesser eye than Poirot's would have looked at the table and seen 4 entire strangers, and an unrelated old-school photograph, and would have gone away from it perfectly content, and would have been perfectly wrong. Poirot did not go away. He drew the storm lamp close to the table and took up from his pocket the small, folding magnifying glass that he carried for precisely such offices as this, and he bent over the faces and looked, not at the things that change, but at the things that cannot change. For there is in every human face a small handful of things that no actor, however gifted, however determined, may ever truly discard. He looked at the ears, which a man cannot alter, and which a man very seldom remembers even to think of hiding. In every photograph, across 30 years and 4 names, he found the same curious lobe, attached close to the head, folded over upon itself at the rim like the furled leaf of a flower. He looked at the left eyebrow and found in each, faint but faithful and always in the same place, the small pale seam of an old healed scar, the kind a child gets from a fall against a step. He observed that the hand which had signed the deposition of Edmund Vane, and the hand which held the famous fountain pen in Sebastian Weyl's most reproduced portrait, were both of them the left. And in every single face, across all those years and all those names, sat the very same smile, wide, charming, complete, perfectly formed, and reaching not the smallest distance up into the eyes. The lamp hissed softly on the table. Far below the cliff, the turning tide drew off the stones with a long sigh, and somewhere in the dark a gull called once. "Mais oui," said Poirot, almost without sound, to the empty courtroom and the 4 watching faces. "But of course, there was never more than one of you. There was only ever the one." There came a knock at the great door, and Inspector Pengelly let himself in with a telegram flimsy in his hand, and his square, honest face was very solemn. "From the county, monsieur." The sergeant got across and got an answer back before the tide. There was such a place, a charity orphanage, on a hill above a mill town in the north, and there was such a fire in the very year you said. He laid the flimsy down upon the table among the photographs. The official register burned with the building, every name in it gone to ash, which is no doubt why the thing was never properly looked into. But the old matron, it seems, kept a private list of her own in a notebook, and her daughter has it yet, and read it down the wire. He drew a breath. 8 children came out of that fire alive, monsieur. 8. 7 of them were claimed by relations, or placed in service or in other homes within the year, and their names are all set down. But the 8th, he looked up. The 8th was the smallest of them, a little girl, and she was never entered upon the list at all. The matron wrote against the place where her name should be only this, that the child had been taken away by a gentleman visitor, and she gave no name for the child, and she gave no name for the gentleman. Poirot looked down at the small, clean oval hole snipped in the old photograph, and then across at the telegram, and the 2 absences lay there side by side, upon the table in the lamplight, and they were one and the same absence. "A gentleman visitor," he murmured. "Yes, I see it." He could not leave her there, you understand, Inspector. For all that he was, even he could not leave the smallest one of them behind in that place, alone after the fire. So he took her, and he raised her, and he loved her, truly in the only fashion he had ever learned. And then he cut her small face out of the one photograph that proved she had ever existed, and he left her out of the story of his life altogether entirely, so that the great and sole survivor of St. Aldwyn's should be himself, and himself alone, forever. He set the magnifying glass down upon the table, and there was no triumph at all in his small, tired face, none whatever. He gave that child everything, Inspector, everything in the world, except the one single thing that was truly hers, that she was owed by right and could be given by no one else. He never gave her back her place in the truth. He rose and squared the scattered photographs to the edge of the table with the unconscious, neat motion of his hands, and stood a moment looking down at the four faces of the man who was one man. "Tonight," he said, "we shall finish it. The library, if you please, Inspector. The room the builder called his courtroom. The room in which Sebastian Vale stood up before us and ceased to be. Let it be lit with candles only, and the more of them the better. And ask them all to come to it. Everyone. There is a thing in that room I wish to show them." They gathered as the first truly dark and starless night, since the murder came down over the island and shut it off entirely from the world. The tall windows of the courtroom gave on to a sea that could not be seen, only heard, breaking far below against the rock. The candle flames stood up straight and unwavering in the still air, and the chairs had been set out again in their half-circle, as they had stood on the night Vale vanished. So that the room remembered itself. Poirot waited, small and grave at the head of them all, until the seven were seated. And then he asked, in a quiet and courteous voice, for the things that he required to be brought to him and set out upon the little table at his side. The old photograph from the orphanage steps, the cream envelopes the guests had each received at that first dinner, the single recovered page of the vanished memoir, the matron's list copied out in the sergeant's careful hand, and, last of all, in exactly the same mild and unremarkable tone, a single pair of gentlemen's gloves. In the candlelight, Felix Harrow's grey-gloved hands closed slowly, very slowly, upon the carved arms of his chair, and beside him the blood went out of Lucy Harrow's face, draining away from it, degree by degree, until it was as white and as still and as empty as the small snipped oval in the old brown photograph. And Hercule Poirot knew, with a heavy heart, that the thing he had built so carefully over 3 days was about, at the very last, to break. Chapter 9. The Prince Who Lost His Face. Once upon a time, said Poirot, into the waiting silence of the candlelit courtroom, there was a prince who owned 100 masks. The flames stood straight and still. 7 faces turned to him out of the gloom, and he let the strangeness of so beginning settle fully over the room before he went on. He wore a different face for each person whom he wished to charm, this prince, and he charmed them all, everyone, for he was very clever and he was very, very lonely. But a man who is always changing his face, you understand, must keep the discarded ones somewhere. And one grey morning the prince reached up to find his own face, the true one, the single one he had been born with, beneath all the rest, and he discovered, to his great surprise, that he had mislaid it somewhere among the 100, long ago, and could no longer for the life of him remember which one of them it had been. Poirot turned his glass slowly between his fingers, and so he went at last to his grave a much beloved man. and not one single soul who stood at the graveside that day. Not the mourners, not the priest, and least of all the prince himself, could have told you the name of the man whom they had come to bury. It was the Reverend Crane who understood it first, and the warm colour drained right out of his kind face. "You are speaking," he said, hardly above a whisper, "of Sebastian." "I am speaking of a child," said Poirot, "who became Sebastian, among very many others, and briefly, plainly, without any flourish. For these 7 had earned the truth, and not another performance. He told them what he had pieced together in 3 days. The grim orphanage upon its northern hill, the fire in the night that had eaten the register and made all the survivors anonymous. The clever cold boy who had understood, in the smoke, that the dead leave their names lying about behind them, like coats abandoned over the back of a chair, and who had put one on, and then another, and another, climbing all his life upward from one buried self to the next, until at the last he stood among them, a famous and a beloved man. The memoir that was to have been the crown set upon all of it. He did not invite you here in order to confess to you, my friends," Poirot said gently into their stricken faces. "He invited you here in order that you might applaud him. Each of you had loved, or had feared, or had paid a different one of his lives. And he intended that you should learn, all together, in one delicious moment of revelation, that you had every one of you knelt down across the years before the very same magnificent idol. It was never repentance. It was a curtain call. Then who killed him?" Bell broke in, his voice cracking. "And in God's name, how?" The man stood up in front of all 8 of us in this room, with the one door locked on the inside, and walked into the dark and was gone. "He drowned, you tell us, in a bone-dry room at the top of the house. A man cannot do that. Tell me how it is done." "He cannot do it," Poirot agreed, and so he did not. He rose from his chair, and instead of answering Bell, he walked, unhurried, across the courtroom toward the shelves, along the inner wall, the candlelight following him. "You ask the how, Mr. Bell. You were all of you meant to ask it so loudly, and to wonder at it so completely, that none of you should ever find the breath to ask the only question that signified. Very well. Let us be rid of the how together, so that it troubles us no more." He stopped before a small framed sea chart that hung beside the shelves, the one that had offended his eye 3 nights before, that would not sit true upon its nail, and lifted it down and set it on a chair. Then he laid both his small hands flat as against the oak panel behind it, the panel that stood a hair's breadth proud of its fellows, and pressed. There was a soft click, an oiled click, the very twin of the one he had heard in the dark, and the panel swung inward upon a black slot of a doorway, and beyond it, narrow and windowless, a stair went steeply down into the dark. Lady Imogen made a small sound. Bell came half out of his chair. "The builder was a man of the theatre, in his fashion," Poirot said, looking into the dark slot and not at them. "He made a courtroom, and a courtroom must have its private door, by which authority may come and go unseen by those it judges. He hid it well, behind the shelves, behind a panel that sat flush, until the years warped it the breadth of a hair, and set the picture beside it forever askew. Mademoiselle Moore did not know of it. She told us in this room on that night that there was no way out she had ever known, and she told the truth. The servants used the old stair from the cellars to the eaves. None of them ever knew that one panel of the courtroom opened upon it. He turned. This is the way Sebastian Vale left us. Not through the door you guarded, through the wall at your backs, but the door. Belle would not let it go. The key was turned. On the inside, I turned it back myself, and there was the misdirection, complete and perfect. Poirot came back toward them. The lock of that door had been freshly oiled. I found the oil on my fingers that night and thought it very strange, for nothing else in this neglected room had felt the touch of care in 20 years. It was oiled so that, in the dark, the turning of the key and the fall of the latch should sound crisp and near and certain, and draw every ear in the room to the one door, while a man slipped without a sound through the wall behind you. A conjurer does not hide the thing he does, mesdames et messieurs. He gives you something louder to look at, and you hide it from yourselves. He inclined his head. Monsieur Harrow, your gloves, if you would be so good. The room held its breath with the candle flames. Felix Harrow looked at Poirot for a long moment, and then, with the slow and terrible dignity of a man laying face up a hand of cards he has bluffed, past its strength, he peeled the fine grey kid from first the one hand and then the other, and laid the gloves across his knee. The hands beneath were seamed and shining and ridged, the skin drawn waxen and tight, scarred all over with the long-healed scars of a terrible burn. He had hidden them. Poirot did not doubt, beneath those immaculate gloves for 30 years. It was you who cut the switch in the cellar at the appointed second, monsieur, Poirot said, gently now. You who fired the blank cartridge for the shock of it, the dreadful punctuation that froze us where we sat. The disappearance was yours. A thing the two of you, friends of 40 years, had planned together down to the last beat. Vale was to vanish before our eyes, and then to walk back into the candlelight as if risen from the dead, the manuscript in his hand, and read us the true and only chapter of his life. It was to be the grandest effect of either of your careers. He paused. It was not played to its end. Felix said nothing. His scarred hands lay open and still in his lap. He went down the stair I have opened for you, Poirot went on to the room. Down through the heart of the house to the tidal pool, the builder cut into the rock at its foot, where the sea comes and goes through a low gate, and where an old door opens into the dark below this house. There he was to wait for his cue. And there, at the black edge of the water, someone was waiting for him. He let it sit. He drowned in the salt of that pool. That is the salt we tasted in his hair and on his collar. And that is why the floor of the last room, high and dry under the eaves, had not a drop upon it. He did not die where we found him. He was carried there. Carried. Belle's voice had dropped. Up all that way. By whom? By that same stair, in the long hours of the dark. While the rest of us went up and down the great staircase with our lamps, searching, calling out, none of us watching any other closely, every one of us certain the danger was a man who had vanished, and not the two who walked among us still. Poirot's gaze did not leave Felix. It is heavy work to carry a man up through a house. But there were two of you, and you had the whole of the night, and the one door no one would open before dawn, because it was locked, and you had locked it. He turned back to them all. The last room was sealed as this room was sealed. By craft, not by miracle. A strong thread looped about the bow of the key, the door drawn to from the corridor. The thread pulled, so, until the key turns over in the ward, and then the thread drawn out through the gap and away, leaving the key standing, turned upon the inner side, and an impossibility behind it. It is an old trick. Any locksmith knows it. Any conjurer has done it for a wager. And when Mr. Bell broke that lock from its seating with his shoulder, he destroyed, most thoroughly, the very marks that might have shown it. For which, Mr. Bell, no one in this room reproaches you. And the clocks, said the Reverend, almost to himself, 11 and 17. Set by a grieving hand, mon père, to the hour the orphanage burned. A signature. A truth told in the one language that was left. Poirot spread his hands. There is your how, the whole of it. A warped panel, a length of thread, a switch in a cellar, a private stair, an old salt pool beneath a house. Nothing impossible anywhere in it. The impossibility was a costume, and nothing more, put on so that we should stare at the marvel and never look beneath it. Not how he died. That was never the question they wished us to leave unasked. Why? He let the silence hold a moment longer. Then he turned away from Felix Harrow, who sat now with his ruined bare hands open in his lap and his head bowed over them, and he looked at the girl beside him. Mademoiselle Lucy. The name fell into the cold, bright room like a single stone dropped into the black tidal pool below. No, said the Reverend Crane at once, half rising. No, not the child. Anyone in this room but her, Monsieur Poirot. She is the one wholly good thing in this entire wretched and miserable business. She is the honest one, said Lady Imogen, her gloved hand gripping the arm of her chair. You said it of her yourself, monsieur, to my face. You said she was the honest one. I did, said Poirot, and his voice was very heavy and very tired. I said it. It was true, and it is true still. And then Lucy Harrow began to weep. Not, Poirot saw, and the seeing of it ached in him like an old wound in cold weather, as the guilty weep, in fear, twisting away from the light. She wept as one weeps who has carried a single great stone an enormous distance, for years alone, and is told at last, by someone who finally knows, that she may set it down now, that she may put it down upon the ground and rest. The relief that was in her weeping was a terrible thing to stand and watch. You found me, she whispered through it. I never thought that anyone in the world ever would. I am not even in the photograph anymore. He cut me out of it. He cut me out with the nail scissors years ago, and I watched him do it. And he told me it was so that no one could ever take me away. You are the 8th child, said Poirot, very softly, the smallest one, the little girl the matron's list could never name, while he wore his 100 lives and was loved by the world in every one of them. You, mademoiselle, had no single life that was truly your own at all, only the one that he chose to give to you, and the truth that he chose, always, to keep from you. He saved you from the fire, in his fashion, with the burned hands of Monsieur Harrow there, who carried you out of it. He paid for your schooling. He taught you to read upon a nursery floor, and he taught you to swim off these very rocks. And then he erased you from the story of his life, as cleanly and completely as he cut your small face out of that photograph, so that the one great survivor of St. Aldwyn's folly should be himself and himself alone to the very end. "I never knew," she said. "For years and years and years I never knew what he was, monsieur, nor what I was, nor where I had come from. He was only kind to me. He was only ever kind. And then I found the manuscript. 3 weeks ago, before any of you ever came, I found it in his desk and I read it through, the whole of it, alone. I read what he meant to stand up and read aloud to all of you." Her voice was steadying now, finding a dreadful flat clarity. "He had written every one of us into it as scenery, Monsieur Poirot. The children who had died in the fire, a paragraph apiece, no more, a line of pathos before he moved on. And me, not even that. Not a paragraph, not a line, not a single word. I was not in it anywhere, and he himself was the hero of every page." She drew one long, shaking breath. "When he came down to the pool in the dark to wait for his cue, I was there. I had gone down to wait for him, and I asked him only one thing. I asked him to put me in the book, only to say, somewhere in one line, that I had lived, that I existed, that I had been there too, and come out of the fire too, and was real." Her hands had closed in her lap, the honest hands her father had always despaired of. And he laughed at me. He stood there in the dark, and he laughed gently, the way he had always laughed at the small, foolish things, I said. And he told me that he was the survivor, the only survivor that had ever mattered or ever would, and that the dead and the forgotten made the very best material of all for a writer, because the dead and the forgotten cannot ever answer back. And I told him that he was not a survivor at all. I told him he was a thief, and he laughed again. And the water was right there, and a whole long lifetime of being no one at all rose straight up in me, all at once, like the tide coming in over the causeway. And when it had gone out again, he was under the water, and I was holding him down beneath it with both my hands, and I was not sorry. She looked up, and her eyes were dry now. "I am sorry now. I want you to believe that. But I was not sorry then. Not for one moment of it." Felix Harrow made a low, broken animal sound and put his terrible, scarred hands up over his face. The man who had carried this child out of one drowning long ago, and who had tried, too late and far too cleverly, and with all the art of his trade, to hide her from a second. And Hercule Poirot, who had unravelled the whole of it, who had read the clocks and the salt and the snipped photograph and the 7 smiling figures, and arrived, as he always in the end arrived, at the truth, found that he took no pleasure whatsoever in being right. Chapter 10. The Tide Goes Out. The morning came bright and indifferent, as June mornings on that coast will, and gave back the causeway to the world stone by wet shining stone, indifferent altogether to whom it now invited away across it. Lucy Harrow made her formal confession upon the terrace, in the clean early sun, with the gulls turning and crying overhead, and Inspector Pengelly's pencil moving slow and careful across the pages of his notebook. She gave it plainly, and she left nothing out of it. The manuscript she had found, and read alone in the empty house before any of the guests arrived, the words in it that had made painted scenery of the dead children and silence, total silence, of herself, the long walk down the dark inner stair to the tidal pool to wait for him. The one small thing she had asked of him there, his gentle laughter, the water that had been right there at her feet. She did not weep again. She had done all of her weeping the night before, in the courtroom, and a strange, deep composure had settled over her since, the particular calm of a person who has, after a whole lifetime, at last been given permission to exist. Felix Harrow stood at her shoulder throughout the whole of it, his scarred hands bare now and folded quietly before him. In the sun, the grey gloves gone forever, and when she had finished, and Pengjali had read the statement back, he said only one thing, and he said it without any defiance and without any shame. I would do every part of it again. I have spent the whole of my life, gentlemen, in the business of making people see what is not there and not see what is. I am not ashamed to have tried it one last time for her. Pengjali wrote that down too, in his slow hand, and Poirot, who knew very well that the law would call what Felix Harrow had done by cold and accurate names, conspiracy and concealment and the obstruction of justice, said nothing at all, for there are some loyalties that a wise man does not trouble to argue with. When the police launch had carried them both away across the bright water, the father and the daughter sitting close together in the stern and not once looking back, Inspector Pengjali lingered a moment with Poirot upon the stone slip. A clever piece of work, monsieur, and I'll be the first to own it. I'd not have seen the half of it in a year of Sundays. He turned his cap in his square hands. But I'll tell you plain, it sits ill with me. That poor young woman, who never did a wrong thing in her life till 3 nights ago, and the old conjurer, who only ever loved her, and the dead one upstairs, the blackest villain of the whole pack by a country mile, and him the only one of them the law can't lay a finger on, him being dead and beyond it. He shook his sandy head slowly. Where's the justice in it, monsieur? That's what I keep coming back round to. Where's the justice? There is the justice of the courts, Inspector, which you will now go and administer, and which is right and necessary, and which I would not for the world have you neglect, said Poirot slowly, his eyes following the launch out across the dazzle of the water. And then there is another reckoning, an older one and a slower one, that the courts can never reach with their warrants and their juries. Reflect upon it a moment with me. There are murders that are committed in a single minute, in the dark, beside cold water, by a hand that did not even come there meaning to kill. And there are murders that are committed across 30 long, patient years, with kindness itself for the weapon, and with love for the disguise, that take from a living human soul not her breath, no, but her very name, herself, her place among the living, and leave her walking about in the world, quite emptied out, a person made of someone else's silences. The law, Inspector, weighs only the first kind of murder. It has no scale that will take the weight of the second. He sighed, a small, heavy sound. Mademoiselle Lucy ended the life of a man, in a moment, by the water. Sebastian Vale ended the life of a child, and then went on quietly ending her, day after day, for 30 years, and called it love, and was thanked for it. I have caught the murderer, Inspector. I am very far from certain that I have caught the worst of the criminals. He took no pleasure in any of it. He felt only a great and settled tiredness, and the particular grey sorrow of a man whose one great gift has shown him, once again, a thing that he would very much rather not have been made to know. Within the house, through that long, bright morning, the surviving five gathered their separate courage, and, by slow degrees, the truth of what they had all been part of. It was a strange and a quiet reckoning. Lady Imogen Ashcroft learned that the swindler she had buried 30 years ago and the famous novelist she had crossed an island to despise had been, all along, one single creature wearing two of his coats, and she found, to her own great surprise, that the knowledge of it set her free at last. The long shame of poor Mrs. Vane and the cold contempt of Lady Ashcroft cancelled one another quietly out, like two columns of an old account finally squared, and she went down to her waiting motor car, a good deal lighter than she had come up from the boat. Nathan Bell came to understand that the man who had broken him in Chicago in his youth, and a man to whom he had paid his secret tribute every year for 20 years, had been the very same man, and that the debt, the whole crushing weight of it, had died in the tidal pool with its owner, and his long, hard anger, finding all at once that it had nowhere left in the world to stand, simply lay down quietly inside him and was still. The Reverend Matthew Crane sat for a long hour alone in the little never-used chapel down by the gate, and when at last he came out of it into the sun, he had left his silver flask behind him upon the altar rail, whether in penance or in farewell, or simply because he found he no longer needed it. No one could say, and no one asked. And Evelyn Moore, who had served Sebastian Vale faithfully for years and had grieved for him, truly and without performance, wept the hardest of any of them in the end. When she came at last to understand that the master she had loved and served and mourned had never, in any single particular, in any one of his parts, actually existed at all. She had been the devoted secretary to a fiction. The loyalty of all those years had been spent, every hour of it, upon a man who was made entirely and only of other men. Each of the five had loved, or had feared, or had paid, a different mask. And each of them now held in the hand the same small, bitter coin of knowledge, that the face beneath all of the masks together had been, at the very last, and at the very first, only a frightened orphan child, running, who had learned too young and too well the one lesson of his life, that a man need never be caught, if only he is never, truly, anyone. Poirot left St. Aldwyn's Folly upon the afternoon tide, and he did not look back at the dark manor on its cliff as the boat drew away, for he had seen quite enough in his time of houses that remember. It was some days later, in the warm and comfortable order of his own rooms, with Miss Lemon's typewriter clicking faithfully and reproachfully beyond the door, and a tisane cooling at his elbow, that he told the whole of the affair to Captain Hastings, who had come up to town, and who listened throughout, with his honest open face growing longer and longer and sadder and sadder. What a perfectly ghastly business, Poirot, from beginning to end. A wasted girl and a clever monster, and a poor old conjurer in the dock for the crime of love. Hastings turned his glass round and round in his fingers. But I keep coming back to the one thing, mon vieux, and I can't get past it. All those names, all those different lives, one on top of another. Who was he, really? Sebastian Vale, Edmund Vane, the rest of them. At the very bottom of it all, underneath every single mask, who was the man? Poirot was quiet for a little while. He took out from his pocketbook the 4 cryptic letters that had begun the whole of it, and laid them out upon the table in their order, and squared their edges gently from old and unbreakable habit. Can a man commit murder without killing anyone? Can a stolen life be returned? How many names may a man wear before he loses his own? If I die before Saturday, burn this invitation. He asked me these 4 questions, Hastings, before ever I had seen his face, before I knew his name, or any of his names, he said softly. And I think now that some small part of him, buried very deep beneath all the rest, half wished to be answered. A man does not write such letters as these to a detective, to a stranger, a finder out of secrets, unless somewhere inside him he longs, just the once, just at the very end, to be found out, to be known truly by one other living soul, before the dark. He gathered the 4 letters together into a neat square. You ask me who he was, at the bottom of it. I have thought of very little else for a week, and the best that I can tell you, mon ami, is only this. He was a man who spent the whole of his life searching for himself in the lives of other people, and who never once, in all those years, thought to look for himself in his own. Hastings glanced up sharply, for he had never, in all their long acquaintances, heard quite that note in his friend's voice before, and he was startled, and a little moved to find that Hercule Poirot, surely the most thoroughly self-satisfied man in all of London, sounded for the moment simply and entirely sad. Off the Cornish coast, the next morning came again to St. Aldwyn's Folly, perfect and innocent and indifferent, as though nothing whatever had happened there. The tide drew back from the causeway exactly as it had on the bright day Poirot first crossed over it. The old roses opened their heavy heads in the warming air. The gulls wheeled and cried above the empty cliffs, and the great house stood shuttered and silent on its rock, keeping its own counsel as it had always kept it. But high up beneath the eaves, in the last room, where time itself had been stopped, and then started again, and then stopped once more by a careless and a frightened hand. One small forgotten clock, the little gilt one no bigger than a thimble upon the window-sill, had not after all been silenced. In the great stillness of the empty house it began, very faintly, to tick, not backward, toward the fire and the smoke and the running child, nor forward, toward any reckoning or any justice, simply onward, steady and patient and indifferent. And through the open window came the warm scent of summer roses, drifting room by quiet room, through a house that had spent 30 years faithfully guarding a stolen name, and that would now, at the last, be allowed to set it down and forget it.